Live from Washington, D.C.
I'm literally staying because of the actions that have been taken. I had long planned to be retiring, the things that have happened in the last 3 months have, I think, left me no choice but to stay until I see them through at least that long. In addition, I don't see how this will interfere. My intention is not to interfere.
Tonight, Powell's last stand. Jay Powell says he'll stay on as governor at his final news conference as Fed chair after officials leave rates unchanged with 4 dissenters. Trump's pick for the new chair, Kevin Warsh, clearing a key Senate hurdle. What it all means for policy straight ahead. Plus $25 billion, the amount Pentagon officials say has been spent on the war with Iran so far. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth facing tough questions on Capitol Hill as President Trump rejects the latest offer from Tehran, with Brent crude rising today to multi-year highs. In an exclusive interview this hour, Democratic Senator Elissa Slotkin and Republican Senator Bernie Moreno join us on the escalating conflict and the path forward, at least on Capitol Hill. And deciding the market's fate, 4 of the Mag 7 report, Meta, Alphabet, Amazon, and Microsoft, all out with results after the bell. We've got Bloomberg Tech co-hosts Caroline Hyde and Ed Ludlow to help us break them down. From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. I'm Joe Matthew. Kaylee Lyons is off tonight. We dive straight into those tech earnings with Ed Ludlow now from our San Francisco bureau and Caroline Hyde from World Headquarters in New York, the co-hosts of Bloomberg Tech. Ed, I'm going to start with you here in the quarters from Meta and Alphabet with 2 very different reactions on Wall Street. You want to start with the good news or the bad news?
Let's start with the good news and go with Google. Basically, astonishing growth in the cloud business, 63%. Quarter on quarter, 40% growth in enterprise for Gemini. That's their AI model that they are selling use of to businesses. And it's kind of the same metric that we would hold OpenAI or an Anthropic to account on. And so the market's been really cheering that. On the course of the call, which is kind of early and underway, Sundar Pichai has been talking up basically how good they've got at the economics of AI. So the cost per query has come down significantly. The latency on search and people using search more for AI has improved. And now they see an opportunity in the future where their own custom chips that were the underpinnings of their work in AI are now going to be used by third parties in their data centers, which opens up a new opportunity. That's pretty much the sum of it so far, but it's all about cloud growth and showing that the investment thus far was worth it.
And it's looking pretty good after hours. Alphabet shares up $20, almost 6%. And it's a different story from Meta. And investors are once again concerned about CapEx spending. Did they raise the number? What's the issue?
Yeah, they raised it, and it's a monster number at the high end to $145 billion. It's a range. But you have to offset the capital expenditures number with the expected growth on the other side. And we went into this mega earnings, we're calling it Earnmageddon, with that calculus in mind. So Meta basically said that ads, their core business, they make money from advertising, is being improved by AI. But the sales outlook for the second quarter, that's the period we're in right now, basically, they gave a range up to $61 billion, where the midpoint was bang in line with estimates. And so that's what Wall Street's been calling for. If you're going to give a very large capital expenditures number, the money you spend on the chips to train and power AI, we also want to see that there is some real tangible AI revenue growth on the other side. And so far, the revenue outlook has not convinced the market of that with Meta.
And we're seeing the reaction in the market, a visceral one, down more than 6% now. For a look at Amazon and Microsoft earnings on this Earnmageddon, is that what we're calling it? We turn to Bloomberg Tech co-host Caroline Hyde with us live from New York. Caroline, I'm so happy you're here. These are, of course, 2 of the Mag 7, and we're getting mixed results in this case as well. Do you want to start with Amazon or Microsoft here?
Well, let's show what the similarities are. And both actually beat. Both beat in terms of revenue. Both beat in terms of their profitability. Both beat in terms of the growth in their cloud businesses. And you're seeing Microsoft push out to 39% growth. You're seeing, if you're stripping out the FX impact, you're seeing also Amazon really return to the growth we haven't seen since 2022 in their part of AWS. But here's the but. What's different and what's interesting about the share price reaction is Amazon's saying, remember how they dropped the mic moment last quarter, $200 billion in capital expenditure? Andy Jassy's saying, I'm spending that. They spent $40 billion in the previous quarter. That was really where we're starting to see the rubber hit the road. Things are getting more expensive to build out the data centers. They're grasping all that demand, but they have to meet it with the supply, and that costs. But more broadly, what is also a similarity between these two companies is the share price has rocketed in the last month of April. So Amazon is near a record high. Maybe that's why we pull back a little bit. Over at Microsoft, now they too have beaten and they too are spending. But actually what's interesting is Amy Hood, the CFO, really showing out that capital expenditure is dialing back a little bit where the street had thought it was going to be. Their actual capex was a little bit leaner than where many had anticipated, but still they're being punished because maybe just the Azure reward isn't there enough. People are more worried with Microsoft that their supply isn't enough to grasp the amount of demand, to put on more of their Copilot, to really see the bottom line impact of all of the capital expenditure. So that wasn't enough to really ease some of the anxiety that's come into the market, particularly after the reporting on OpenAI, and that maybe they're not going to be looking for as much capital expenditure going forward from them because, well, they're not seeing people adopt this overall use case of AI in quite the amount that we thought.
Okay, Caroline. So are these conference calls underway, or are people trading only on headlines right now?
Well, in terms of, we heard that Alphabet's already off to the races. We know that Meta's going to be starting about now. We're looking at Amazon and Microsoft more broadly. We are starting to hear things from Satya and from Andy Jassy more broadly, but we need to really understand exactly what the sort of details are going to be. But CFO Satya, look, if you go into the actual earnings statement, had highlighted that the AI growth of the business is there, more than doubling. And we're seeing that AI is fueling billions of dollars in rewards. But are we having to see that also impact where they spend elsewhere? Remember, it was just earlier this week, we were hearing that 7% of Microsoft's workforce is going to be asking maybe to take early retirement. So this is just how a company is trying to do that difficult balancing act. Expect many of those questions on for Amy Hood, the CFO, as well, just really how they're dialing up their capital expenditure and where they're going to see the reward from that if they can get things online and if it's costing more.
Really fascinating. It takes a big night to get Bloomberg's Ed Ludlow and Caroline Hyde on Balance of Power, and this is one. Thank you both so much. You can catch Ed and Caroline, of course, every morning, 11 a.m. Eastern Time. Bloomberg Tech on Bloomberg TV. The Federal Reserve, our other major story in Washington, leaving interest rates unchanged today while revealing a deepening division over the outlook for policy, with 4 officials in dissent. Fed Chair Jay Powell providing some insight into the decision in his final news conference as chair, while revealing what he plans to do after his term expires.
We think our policy rate is in a good place. People are not saying we need to hike now. I don't think there's much of a case for any case really for policy looking, meaningfully restrictive, maybe mildly restrictive or neutral. I will continue to serve as a governor for a period of time to be determined. I plan to keep a low profile as a governor. There's only ever one chair of the Federal Reserve Board. When Kevin Warsh is confirmed and sworn in, he will be that chair. The things that have happened in the last 3 months have, I think, left me no choice but to stay. I am confident, as I said in my remarks, that the Fed will continue to make its decision based on analysis, rigorous analysis, and not on political considerations, but we've had to fight for it.
All right, joining us now with the latest from today's Fed decision, Bloomberg's Michael McKee, who was, of course, in the room during Jay Powell's final news conference. We're kind of misty today after all of this. It's great to see you. And this was more than a lot of people expected to hear. Scott Bessent on another network just called it an insult. Will he simply stay at the Fed until any threat of legal action is gone?
Well, I mean, he hasn't told me personally, but I think that's the
implication.
That's the implication, is that he doesn't trust the Department of Justice, and he knows that the president carries out his efforts at revenge. And so even if the Inspector General's report clears him, they might come up with some sort of way to, entangle him in the justice system that he doesn't want to see happen. And I think he also may want to keep them from doing a Bill Barr on the IG's report.
Right.
If you remember, Barr came out, he was Attorney General at the time the Mueller report came out, and he spun it in a completely opposite direction, basically, of what the report said. So I think those are motivating him. I think he would otherwise be retiring and let Warsh do what he's going to do.
So Kevin Warsh cleared committee today. Pretty important after Tom Tillis dropped his opposition. Clears the banking committee, could be on the floor by the end of this week, we're told. Talk to us about his ability to achieve consensus. I know that's something you brought up in the news conference today.
Well, it's going to take a while. He knows the Fed, he knows the people, he knows how it works, so that helps. But, of course, he's brand new. He's also in something of a box because the economy, as Jay Powell laid out today, certainly is not in a position to handle rate cuts. And you have a lot of people who are demanding, well, not demanding rate increases, but saying that, we should be telling people that we could get rate increases. Because with inflation rising the way it is, and he said tomorrow we'll get the PCE numbers for March, and he said it's going to be 3.5%. Well, the target's 2%. So we're going way in the wrong direction. And there's no sign of an end to the war. So at this point, the Fed can't consider cutting interest rates. So maybe Warsh comes in and has a couple meetings where nothing really happens. He can start building maybe support for dumping the dot plot if people are in favor of that, or for changing the way they do their economic projections. But I don't think we're going to be able to call it a Warsh Fed very quickly.
Interesting. I want to hear your back and forth with the Fed chair earlier today. If we have that for our listeners and viewers, let's watch and listen.
If you think about it, every new Fed chair has the same situation, which is you've got 18 colleagues on the FOMC, 11 of them vote during any year, and your job is to create consensus. It's to talk to them, understand them, be inside their thinking, and be able to pull them together and get consensus and move. And that's what every Fed chair has to do. And I think Kevin Warsh is actually quite well. He has the capabilities, skills to be very good at that, I would think.
Interesting. Of course, we've got a lot of price pressures that we talk about every day here on Balance of Power and all day on Bloomberg. You see crude oil today. Brent's at the highest since 2022. We're in triple digits for WTI. Gas at $4.22. What's this mean for?
Well, I think the Fed is looking over the horizon.
How long can you look through it?
Even well, that's the thing. He said basically we can't look through this because we don't know how high it's going to go. And if you listen to all the oil analysts and people in the Middle East, they say the markets are not even incorporating how bad this is going to be and how long it's going to last till we can get something more back to normal. So there's going to be an impact on the economy that we haven't even felt yet. And the Fed knows that. They just don't know how much or how long it'll last, so they have to be careful about what they're doing. And Warsh is going to be stuck with that same problem as well.
Great to have you in D.C., as always. Bloomberg's Michael McKee on a Fed day. And a major ruling today as well, the Supreme Court voting to limit the use of the Voting Rights Act to create predominantly black or Hispanic election districts, voting 6-3 along ideological lines. The justices rejected a Louisiana congressional map drawn with a second majority black district after a lower court found an earlier map to be discriminatory. Joining us now with details of today's decision we've been waiting for a long time, Bloomberg's Greg Stohr, the best, as I always say, Supreme Court reporter in the business. So here we are. What does this mean for that second district in Louisiana, and could it prompt congressional districts being rewritten nationally?
So it means that second district is unconstitutional. The Louisiana legislature will have a chance to redraw it and may well convert that into another predominantly Republican as well as predominantly white district. In terms of what it means around the country, that remains to be seen. It doesn't necessarily invalidate other districts like that in other states, but it could give Republicans in particular who are considering trying to do a last-minute redraw of their maps kind of an excuse to do that, give them something to point to say, hey, we need to eliminate that majority black or majority Hispanic district.
Got it. Now, to be clear, this is happening in the throes of a major redistricting effort that's happening around the country, partisan redistricting, something that President Trump started in Texas, and it's become a R's versus D's exercise as we now move to Florida. This ruling essentially bans racial gerrymandering, but codifies the legality of partisan redistricting. Is that right?
Yeah, well, the codification sort of happened in an earlier ruling, and the court kind of doubled down on it here and said essentially that if a state says, we want to protect this incumbent, or we want to maximize our partisan advantage in a state, that if somebody is coming along saying, hey, you're discriminating against black voters and you need to create a majority black district, well, you have to create that district in a way that doesn't undermine those political goals of the state. So Louisiana, for example, is still going to be able to, if it wants to, say, we want to have at least 5 Republicans in our 6 districts.
I understand. It's an important ruling, of course, and Bloomberg's Greg Stohr was all over it for us today. We thank you, Greg. Find him on the terminal and online. Coming up, the Pentagon saying the U.S. has now spent an estimated $25 billion in the war with Iran. We'll talk it out with Michael Allen at Beacon Global Strategies next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
There will never be a deal unless they agree that there will be no nuclear weapons. The blockade is genius, okay? The blockade has been 100% foolproof. It shows how good our Navy is, I can tell you that. Nobody's going to play games. We have the greatest military in the world, and I built much of it during my first term, and we've been building it since. Now they have to cry uncle. That's all they have to do, just say, we give up. We give up. But their economy is really in trouble.
And so the standoff continues. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington, where we heard from President Trump today with the update there on the state of the U.S.-Iran conflict. Joining us now with more in our Washington bureau is Michael Allen, Managing Director of Beacon Global Strategies, former Special Assistant to President George W. Bush in the national security sector. Michael, it's great to have you with us. President Trump appears to be bracing for a longer standoff, with reports today that he's telling aides to prepare for an extended blockade of the Strait of Hormuz. That would indicate that we're holding off on military action for now. We can wait them out?
I think so. I think, unfortunately for us, these types of blockades are designed to work slowly, but we've got to give it time to really unleash its force on the Iranian economy, to make sure that we're honestly just putting it into enough of an economic stranglehold as possible, to hope that they then get more interested in opening up the straits in an unimpeded way. And then, of course, maybe even going as far as concessions on their nuclear file.
Okay. With that said, is the idea that we have to wait them out until they feel it economically, or they have to start closing oil wells? They're running out of storage, Michael, and that could be advantage U.S.
Yeah, I think the storage of oil is a big plus for us. That's one of the factors everyone is studying. But, also there's just sort of a mental factor about the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the way that regime was born in anti-Americanism, the questions about whether their ideology would permit them under these circumstances to strike a compromise with us. Might they just hang in there even amidst economic devastation, just because it's just sort of against their nature to compromise with us?
The president gathered energy executives at the White House yesterday. I guess must have been while King Charles was on Capitol Hill, head of Chevron, among other companies, in the room as he gamed out a series of options, including more kinetic action, to see how the energy markets might respond. We're beyond $100 a barrel for WTI and Brent, both today. In fact, to put a finer point on it, crude in New York, almost 107. Brent is at $120 here, Michael. What would happen if we started dropping bombs again?
Well, I hope it would be in the service of another idea, which people have discussed, which is an escort mission through the Straits. Okay. Honestly, I thought we would have been there weeks and weeks ago. Instead, we've decided to go with the blockade. But the way it would work, essentially, is we would take a convoy of tankers and or commercial vessels, those that I guess their insurance companies and owners would let them go through, but literally escort them with U.S. destroyers, try and use all the other assets we have in the region to blow up any fast boats or drones or anything coming with them. It'll be more dangerous, But over time, I think we're just going to have to, we might have to just accept a little bit of risk. Now, as part of that mission, I think that would require the use of force, maybe coastal defenses, maybe we want to take out things preemptively before they're fired at us. So I hope it's in the service of something that can get us through this Straits crisis.
Got it. Try this on for size. This just hit the terminal. Reporting by Bloomberg, the U.S. seeks to deploy a hypersonic missile for the first time against Iran. The Army's Dark Eagle hypersonic missile will be sent to the Middle East for possible use. Is that a game changer?
No, I don't think so. I mean, it's exciting if we do have one online and ready to roll. I know we've been testing the longest range versions of them for some time. But, you know, I'm glad we have one. I'm glad we're deploying it. But I don't think it's really a game changer.
Okay. $25 billion. The number fell out of the sky today. People have been asking, including lawmakers who talked to us on this program, how much are we spending? And it's been unclear. If that's the first 2 months of the war, should we assume that that would be doubled in another 2 months? What does this cost average tell you?
Well, it would probably not be that much because presumably we wouldn't be dropping 45 days worth of munitions. But still, it's expensive, and I shouldn't, you know, try and act like it's not.
Well,
I mean, it's a lot of money. The U.S. Navy ships are actually going there in greater volume. We've got more assets coming in. So it's still going to be a very high bill, and it's a reminder to the American people that, you know, military, national security costs a lot, and it's part of their demand that we actually get something out of this. I think we did on the nuclear file and degrading their defense industrial base. But it would be a strategic defeat of us if we allowed them to control the Strait.
Well, with that number in our minds today, you worked for George W. Bush, who not only went to the American people, but he went to Congress and spent a lot of time and effort with his surrogates making the case for an authorization for the use of military force. We're at 60 days now. Will that be the case when we get to 90 days? Republicans are even getting itchy at this point with some involvement of Congress.
I think so. I think that people increasingly will be really interested in coming to the Congress in one way, shape, or form. I mean, by the way, even if you don't seek a formal authorization for the use of military force, you could get up there and brief more. You could get up and do hearings more. You could do ways to assuage people who, at the root of it all, just feel like they don't have any idea of what's really going on. Yeah, so if we could do that, and if I were them, you know, if it gets down to a partisan shirts versus skins, I'd just make sure that we briefed everyone all the time to give the Republicans a place to go. Just say, listen, we're getting the information, and that's what you really want.
Pete Hegseth was on the Hill today. He'll be back tomorrow, making the case for $1.5 trillion Pentagon budget. Are we still going to hear a supplemental budget request from this White House to pay for Iran?
I think it could come. It might also depend on the timing of reconciliation and whether there will be any money inserted there. But, yeah, I think you're going to be hearing about this for some time.
Is that a $200 billion bill like we had first heard, or is it coming down?
No, I mean,
it's going up.
It's going to be big.
Wow.
And if some of it's embedded in the gigantic increase that we're seeking, that might be also something that's just sort of less shocking to people, because if it's in the effort of trying to get us in shape to have a better military for the long haul, given how many fires there are in theaters around the world, then, you know, it's more explainable.
I'll throw you a curveball in our last minute here. There are a lot of investors listening and watching. A lot of them have seen defense stocks run up quite a bit in the run-up to the war. They've been cooling off a lot lately. Is that because the old line defense contractors are not going to benefit from this massive replenishment? Is it going to be the private entities, the small companies that are making drones and other alternative platforms?
I think there's so much money, there's going to be enough for everyone to go around. The big primes also do a lot of things for the United States military. I do think this is the era of defense tech, and if we can't get a lot of them on contract soon, then we've got serious problems that'll ever be possible, because we've got an administration that wants it. We've got a Congress that totally gets defense tech, and so we've really got to get to this stage, because we're seeing innovation like in Ukraine before our eyes.
Well,
we got to be those guys.
It's a flood of money coming. Michael, it's great to have you back with us.
Thank you.
Michael Allen, Managing Director, Partner, Beacon Global Strategies, with the insights on Bloomberg. And coming up, why Democratic Senator Elissa Slotkin of Michigan and Republican Bernie Moreno of Ohio are teaming up. They'll be with us next on Balance of Power, only on Bloomberg. It's Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. You cannot buy Chinese cars in the U.S. thanks to executive action and tariffs from both the Biden and Trump administrations. But a new bipartisan piece of legislation would codify a ban on so-called connected cars from China and the parts and software that could allow Beijing to collect and track your data. I spoke a short time ago with the two senators behind this bill, Democrat Elissa Slotkin of Michigan and Republican Bernie Moreno of Ohio. In an exclusive conversation, I started by asking if they were trying to head off a possible change in policy from President Trump when he soon meets with Xi Jinping.
This bill is inspired by President Trump. Clearly, he's the one that raised the alarm bell over a decade ago about the threat of China. He's also done more for the auto industry here in America than any other president. This is about hermetically sealing the U.S. market from predatory Chinese companies that are funded by the CCP with one simple goal, which is to destroy our auto sector, which is about 10% of our GDP.
Okay. Do you see it that way as well, Senator Slotkin? Is there an inflection point in this meeting with President Xi that concerns you that our market might suddenly be open to Chinese cars and parts?
Well, look, it's a huge deal to have a summit between the president and the Chinese president, and so that we're all sort of thinking about it and talking about it. It's true. President Trump did start this back in his first term, this idea of being able to say, hey, you know, there might be certain products, certain cars, certain things that pose a national security risk, and so we have to restrict those. We just want to continue that same work and make sure we not only have it kind of in rules, right, but we have it in law. And I think, you know, Bernie and I don't agree on everything, but we agree on this from Michigan, from Ohio, that we need both as a national security issue and an economic security issue to keep Chinese cars out of the U.S.
Well, I'm guessing, Senator Slotkin, that you can answer this already for Michigan. It's probably a non-starter, but if affordability is such an important issue right now in this country, wouldn't the addition of Chinese cars on the market lower the price of all vehicles?
Yeah, look, we all know the price sensitivities. People feel they're struggling. They want to be able to afford a car. I think for me, as a former CIA officer, I feel very strongly that these cars aren't just an average cheap car. It is literally a driving surveillance package. It's collecting data on U.S. citizens, on our facilities, on our military bases, and sending it back to China. And then, by the way, their economic playbook on this is quite literally to subsidize the heck out of those Chinese vehicles, flood the market, push out all the other competitors, including Michigan companies, and then have a stranglehold on the market. We're watching this exact playbook go out right now in Germany, in Europe, and I think we're seeing that and saying we're not going to let that happen here in the U.S.
I want to hear more about this driving surveillance package. Senator Moreno, go ahead, sure.
Yeah, if I could just add, look, it's not about because these cars are inexpensive. There's over 90 Chinese brands. This is also a consumer protection angle. They're not all going to survive. So you can imagine a scenario in which dozens of Chinese firms came in, people bought these cars expecting them to have 3, 4, 5, 6-year warranties, and within 6 to 12 months, half these car companies are gone, leaving customers high and dry. So look, as they always say, if it's cheap for a reason, and we're just not going to subject our American workers to that kind of trauma.
You have to start telling people that on Instagram, Senator Moreno. You, like your colleague, are no stranger to the auto business. You worked for GM, and I know that you, at one time, owned a number of car dealerships before you came to Congress. The language in the bill banning, quote, remote takeover of vehicles on American roads jumps off the page to me. Can you tell our listeners and viewers, are there cars on the road right now that could be taken over remotely?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, these cars are basically computers on wheels now. This is not, to use an Oldsmobile commercial, your father's Oldsmobile. These are very complex vehicles with enormous amounts of computer technology that are susceptible to providing data back to the parent company if that's the way its software is written and the hardware is designed. Obviously, American domiciled companies know better because there's massive laws in place. But like TikTok, for example, this is exactly their playbook. They want that data, but it's not just user data. It's high-definition videos, high-definition photos, location data, pattern data. Imagine working at a sensitive military installation and driving one of these vehicles in there. That's just nuts.
A driving surveillance package, I think you called it, Senator Slotkin. As you point out in the language, Under China's national intelligence laws, the sensitive information can be exploited for espionage, surveillance, or worse, as we mentioned, a remote takeover. Is this something that the average family would need to worry about? What information would they be gathering?
Yeah, well, I mean, you mentioned it before. I just want to say remotely piloting a vehicle. So the only thing you would need is imagine a Bluetooth connected device. So your phone or any kind of other device is in your pocket. They have geolocation on a specific person. Let's say one of us is driving in a vehicle. They know who's driving and where they're driving. And then through these Bluetooth devices could conceivably be able to take over the driving of that car. We just saw an example a couple of months ago in the Czech Republic where the Taiwanese president was there and the Chinese had been working on creating a car crash right outside the location where she was, having her speech. So this stuff is not theoretical. It's something that is actually sort of on the agenda. And again, as leaders, we just wanted to make sure we put a marker down in a bipartisan way that we're not going to be accepting that inside this country.
You know, it's something, Senator Moreno, we talk so much about export controls when it has to do with AI chips or other sensitive technologies that we don't want to let get into the hands of China. This is kind of the other side of the coin here. Is the Pentagon aware, for instance, of this capability that you're describing?
Oh, absolutely. This is why we don't allow Chinese drones, why we don't allow Chinese telecommunications equipment to be in our networks. Look, this is, again, a national security imperative. That's why Senator Slotkin's with me on this bill, plus an economic security issue. The auto industry is about 10% of our GDP more in our two states, and we're not going to sit by and allow our towns and communities and companies to be gutted at the expense of companies that would eventually own transportation, which is what would happen. We would be handing over our transportation future to a hostile nation. That is absolutely a non-starter, and I'm hoping that other Western countries, adopt this similar regime: Canada, Mexico, Latin America, Europe.
You know, we're, of course, in a world where we've got companies from Tesla to Google to beyond who are creating robo-taxi fleets right now. And I guess we'll all be driving around in autonomous vehicles at some point. And so, therefore, these chips are being installed, in many cases, NVIDIA chips, in a lot of cars as they're coming off the line, just in case they might be used autonomously. Senator Slotkin, is this a good idea, regardless of manufacturer or country of origin? Should cars be able to be taken over remotely?
Well, look, I mean, technology has done incredible things. Anyone who's been in a new vehicle, American or otherwise, will tell you, like, you can do a lot of stuff in that vehicle that you couldn't do 10 years ago and certainly not 20 years ago. So you're not going to stop progress. You know, the consumer is going to drive things. I think the fundamental difference is that whether it's an American automaker or an allied automaker, think about Toyota from Japan or the Koreans, like, those are allies. They have long-standing relationships, and they understand what it means to be subject to American law. They understand that data can't be used back in their home country. So it's about how you use the technology, not that we should just try and go back to another century where you can't have, GPS or video on in your car. We're going to have that. We just don't want the Chinese controlling it.
Yeah, just to add
so
real
how
quickly,
tough is the sale going to be? Yeah.
Well, Tesla makes almost their entire vehicle here in the U.S. That will be true with the robo-taxis. They're leading on that. Elon Musk has been fantastic about making sure that the car he builds here in the U.S. has a total U.S. supply chain. And as Senator Slotkin just said, they're subjected to U.S. laws and U.S. regulations. They're used to complying with our laws. But look, we're going to make certain that we have the proper EV guardrails. Senator Cruz, who's the chairman of the Commerce Committee, is going to have more hearings about autonomous vehicle regulation. I'm certain we'll get to a good result that protects the consumer but enables innovation here in America.
I'm sure those hearings could help to gather support. Senator Slotkin, do you have a sense of how many senators might back this idea, or do you already have the votes?
Yeah, I mean, I think we certainly, between the two of us, we had an overnight vote the other day, and we were both working our sides of the aisle, and both sides of the aisle actually talking about this issue. And actually, in an era where we don't agree on a ton of stuff, this was, to me, pushing on an open door. I think people understand the threat. They understand and have watched what's happening in Europe, where their, frankly, auto industry is like cratering, and they understand the jobs here in the United States. We assess if Chinese vehicles were brought in, we think we'd lose 400,000 jobs among manufacturers, suppliers, and all the associated businesses. We're not going to do that. So there's a lot of support, I think, on both sides of the aisle.
Well, we appreciate this conversation, and it's not often that we have the two of you together here. So I'd love to just ask you quickly, while we have some time with you, about the war in Iran and what might come next on Capitol Hill with 60 days in now. I was speaking with a Republican senator off the record last evening, Senator Moreno, who said an AUMF would likely have Republican support come 90 days. Is that something that needs to happen if this becomes a longer-term engagement?
Well, look, the kinetic activity has, for the most part, subsided. Now we're yielding our economic might against Iran. But look, every Congress, every president has always agreed that Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. I have full faith and confidence in President Trump and his team to bring this hostilities to a close and reopen the strait and get gas prices down to the historically low levels where they were. And I think that's going to happen sooner than later.
Okay. Senator Slotkin, we learned today $25 billion has been spent so far in this effort. Whether you support it or not, should there be congressional control or codification through an AUMF or a war powers vote? I realize they continue to fail in terms of those that have come to the floor, but what should be the congressional response?
Yeah, I mean, look, we're all prisoners to our experience, and I served 3 tours in Iraq as a CIA officer, so I watched what happens when you're in a war that's easier to get into than out of, and I think we've already been voting here and voting differently, I think, on the war powers resolutions. I do think that on issues of war and peace, just as the Constitution says, this body should be voting on that before you go, and certainly I've heard colleagues talking about, you know, as this thing goes on and as the bill racks up, that Congress's job is to appropriate money. So that should come back to us for a vote on the money, but certainly a vote on approving any further military action. So as someone who has served in tough places, I'm no friend of the Iranian government, right? They killed friends of mine in Iraq. But I think we have to reestablish some congressional counterbalance here, given how difficult the stalemate has become.
Proving you don't have to agree on everything to be able to work together on something. Senators Slotkin and Moreno,
we both agree that Michigan is the national champions in football. But now it's Ohio State. But now it's Ohio State, so it's okay. We
have basketball.
We have basketball now.
Get them next year.
Is this the unity ticket in 2028 I'm talking to?
No, here's the best part. I wasn't born in this country, can never be president of the United States, so it works out really well for me. And my wife has told me I can serve 2 terms or a 3rd term with my second wife. So it's going to be 2 terms in the Senate, and I'm going home.
Democratic Senator Elissa Slotkin, clearly on her own in 28. And Republican Senator Bernie Moreno speaking with us exclusively today on Bloomberg, a conversation you will not hear anywhere else. We have breaking news right now in an already busy after-hours session. This involves Anthropic, and it just went red on the Bloomberg terminal. Bloomberg's Ed Ludlow standing by live in our San Francisco bureau with a scoop in the form of an eye-watering number. Ed, what are you learning?
Yeah, that number is a $900 billion valuation, which if Anthropic were ever to do a deal or raise funds at that valuation, it would leapfrog OpenAI as the world's most valuable AI startup. What sources are telling us, what we're hearing, is that investors are basically going to Anthropic and saying, we want you to raise money, and this is the valuation that we're offering right now. There are no firm term sheets. Anthropic has not accepted this offer. And Joe, you might remember, I think I even came on Balance of Power and discussed our prior report that Anthropic had essentially rebuffed investors who wanted to do around at $800 billion. So that process has kind of accelerated. Early talks, nothing concrete. And we don't really either have a sense of the names that are pushing Anthropic to do this necessarily, but it is in the works.
Stunning report, Ed. You're a news machine. Do we have any idea on timeline, more specifically at this point, for either of these IPOs? Does Anthropic or OpenAI hit the market first?
You know, this is a part of the story. Bloomberg's reported that Anthropic is considering an IPO around October or as soon as October. Oh. It's not uncommon in late, very mature stage technology companies to raise money prior to an IPO in order to bring over crossover investors, anchor investors into the cap table. But there's no suggestion that this would be it, right? It's not immediately obvious why Anthropic would need the money. other than, this kind of milestone of being the world's most valuable AI startup. Right now, they're valued at $350 billion. And, that's an astonishing doubling if they were to proceed with this. Google, the story we broke last week, is investing $10 billion initially, up to $40 billion total, but at that lower valuation of $350 billion. So the mechanics here are complicated.
This is breaking right now, and you can find a lot more on the terminal and online. Bloomberg's Ed Ludlow. Ed, thank you so much. You can find Ed's full story as we speak, and we'll be back with more on Balance of Power here on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Mr. President, in light of today's Supreme Court ruling on the Voting Rights Act, do you want Republican states in the South to look at redrawing congressional districts before the midterms?
You have to tell me, when did the ruling come out? I've been with the astronauts. Tell me about what happened.
Well, some think that the ruling could create more Republican-held congressional seats in the South.
That's good.
Yeah.
That's the kind of ruling I like.
I want to go back to the Supreme Court ruling on the Voting Rights Act. I know you said you haven't seen it.
When did it come out? Just now?
No, it came out this morning, but basically very much narrows the Voting Rights Act.
Was it considered a win for who?
A win for Republicans.
I love it.
But my question...
This is a very good... We can end this news conference right now. I want to read it.
My question...
Wow.
President Trump talking with reporters earlier today in the Oval Office with the surprise of a lifetime. Hours after the Supreme Court ruled that it would limit the use of the Voting Rights Act to create predominantly black or Hispanic election districts, a major ruling that now limits the impact of the Voting Rights Act but still allows partisan redistricting. The president posting on Truth Social more than 7 hours after the opinion, which came out at 10 a.m., as they always do. Today's 6-3 Supreme Court decision in the Calais case is a big win for equal protection, he says, under the law, as it returns the Voting Rights Act to its original intent, which was to protect against intentional racial discrimination. We assemble our political panel for their take. Joining us now, Janae Wartell, Democratic strategist, partner at ARC Initiatives, alongside Republican strategist Annalise Keller, partner at 7Letter. Ladies, great to have you both. Janae, I'll start with you. I'm guessing that you're not going to agree with the president's portrayal or interpretation of this ruling. But what's it going to mean nationally? Louisiana is going to lose a district. How about other states?
That's true. This is a really dangerous ruling by the Supreme Court. And let's remember, the entire point of the Voting Rights Act was to protect voters, particularly voters of color, from this sort of racial gerrymandering that kept them from having power to elect their representatives. And so now with this ruling, we're moving to a place where voters are being chosen by their representatives instead of the other way around. So this has opened the door to states like Florida and other states that have had a history of racial gerrymandering and discrimination against voters to say, hey, it's open season. So it's really quite appalling to hear that the president is satisfied and even happy about this ruling. This is dangerous for democracy.
Disadvantage Democrats in the midterms?
Disadvantage Democrats in the midterms, but also just dilute the power of voters. Right? The entire reason why the Voting Rights Act had to be enacted is to ensure that minority communities and communities across America had equal representation and that there was representation, ability for them to select their representatives. And now diluting the power of these voters is going to have impacts not just for this election, but for generations.
That said, Annalise, advantage Republicans? It was looking like this redistricting effort before the ruling today that President Trump started in Texas might end up being a wash, although Florida could add 4 based on the map we saw approved today. Does this help Republicans keep the House?
I think it still will end up being a bit of a wash.
Yeah.
We will see what happens with Florida, which could counterbalance what's been going on in Virginia.
Right.
I think this ruling, though, it's going to be very difficult for a lot of these southern states to take any action in this midterm cycle because they've already had in some cases their primaries.
I see, right.
So there's some states that have their primaries in August, and so those states could potentially try to do it. But for folks who've already voted and they're in early voting, for example, I just think that there's just not quite enough time to make a really big mark.
Okay, sure. So let's compartmentalize the midterms for a moment then.
Yeah.
Could this still bring about a national wave of redistricting or at least a lot of lawsuits?
I think it will. I think that we have gone down this road.
Yeah.
You can try to talk about when you want to start it, whether you want to start it with what Eric Holder did in New York, whether you want to start it with Texas, which was a little bit of a different, mid-census redistricting effort. But so we have really, I think, as a country, gone down this road of how we want to redistrict. And I think it's just going to continue to be a political struggle. It's like we've opened the can of worms, and I just don't see them going back in.
My gosh. So, Janae, Hakeem Jeffries got a lot of credit for what took place in Virginia, for pushing a lot of states to the point that they were redrawing their maps to offset the effort by President Trump carried out by Republicans in states like Texas. Does he have a new mission now? Is there something Democrats can do to answer this?
Well, I think that what the president really started was this kind of like partisan war related to gerrymandering. And I think what Hakeem Jeffries and others, like in California, have said, we have to respond to this to protect our voters and to ensure that our voters have representation. And so now that we see this ruling, I think that we really have to say, okay, what is the next frontier of the civil rights fight? And I think that Leader Jeffries has really shown that in states where there's still a lot of vulnerable populations, what are going to be the new assaults on voting rights, and how can we be vigilant about it as a party and as a nation?
Really interesting. As we consider the messaging in this midterm cycle, and we were talking to a number of lawmakers about it today, crude oil is well above $100 because of the Strait of Hormuz being closed. When it comes through on the consumer level, we're back now to $4.22 for gas. This keeps on going. Annalise, what's your guess? We could be at $4.50. How many months do Republicans have before this starts to impact decisions in November?
I think some of it has already been baked in, maybe not fully, but people are going to remember this to an extent. And then in terms of what Congress is going to do, I think even with Republicans, I think really President Trump has about 30 days to extend we hit the 60-day mark, of course, and there's sort of this 30-day extension that he can utilize to sort of back out. But I think once we surpass that 30-day mark, there's going to be a lot of Republicans who really are going to sort of struggle and say, look, we need to figure out what the path forward is.
It does appear that more Republicans are preparing for that 90-day mark. We have breaking news here, by the way, guys. This just came from the U.S. House, which somehow has done it, approving a 3-year reauthorization of FISA. They couldn't even get this on the floor a couple of hours ago, so this is a pretty big deal. We've got a vote here, 235 to 191. We're not going to have time to go too deeply into this, but is this as good as extended now? Democrats are good with this?
I mean, look, I think that, what we're seeing in this vote is kind of a new open door where we're going to see how is this going to affect the midterms. And I think that for a lot of people, they're saying, okay, well, this is going to do nothing Congress for quite some time. Is this them actually trying to take action? So I think there's further examination yet from this vote, but we shall see.
Right. This is the hard part, right?
Yeah.
Can this get through the Senate?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I've been tracking this rule process, and Johnson's been really struggling trying to get his conference together. He's had a bunch of hardliners who've wanted to add warrants to this FISA process, and it's not. It has not happened. It's not in this version. So he has really had to muscle this through, and I think he's probably had to make a lot of promises for a potential reconciliation 3.0, and I don't know if he can keep those.
So we're going to be hearing about the deals next, right? The deals will start coming out of the woodwork. Janae Wartell and Annalise Keller with a breaking story. We thank you very much for being with us here on the program. Check out the Washington Edition newsletter. You've got a lot to catch up on. Find it on the terminal and online. And thank you for joining us, as always, on Balance of Power. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. This is Bloomberg.